Everyone, as an informal meeting, I don't have a gavel stand, we just kind of start. The meeting, again, is an informal meeting of the Police and Crime Committee with an open invitation to all members of the Assembly, and I'm really pleased we have so many here today. And again, I'm grateful, due to the relative short notice of the meeting, to get our guest, which is the Mayor. Thank you, Sadiq Khan, for coming along. Deputy Mayor Sophie Linden, AC Martin Hewitt and Daniel Greaves, Crime Director of the UK Home Office. Now I've got my new Verifocus, I can actually read these things, which is wonderful. So thank you very much for coming along today. It is an informal meeting, so just to remind you, colleagues, that it is being recorded but will not be published and updated to the website until after the election. I'd ask again, colleagues, and you know this, I hope you don't mind me reminding you, not to tweet and comment, etc., within the meeting in and of itself, but of course afterwards, please feel free to do what you need to do, and remember, you'll be doing so in your own capacity as Assembly members. Anything that I say to the press will be not as Chair, as you would expect that. So that's that pretty much out of the way. We have a limitation of time, but I anticipate getting you all away by 4:15 at the absolute latest, and I understand that that is perfectly fine. So the context of the meeting, again, this was really reflecting on post-Easter, when we lost two Londoners, and homicides reaching, I was going to say unprecedented, but it isn't unprecedented, but actually very high level of 50 homicides in London this year, and a general increase in serious violence and knife crime. The committee then wanted to question you, summons you with a small s, Mr. Mayor, to find out what your response is to this crisis, and also to hear from senior police. Clearly, we had yesterday's meeting, which we felt was a good meeting. This is a different dynamic. This is London Assembly members on behalf of Londoners holding you individuals, senior individuals, to account, and we want to know what is being done in the immediacy, as opposed to less strategic points, which we heard about yesterday. So that's my introduction. Colleagues are quite happy with that. So what I'd like you to do really is, I'm going to let Martin have the last piece of the introduction, because we want to hear a lot from you, Martin, about the immediacy of your response. But certainly Daniel, who I understand is very modestly denied this, but is a very strong architect of the new report that Amber Rudd discussed yesterday. Perhaps, Daniel, just for 2 or 3 minutes, literally give us an update of that. And then, Mr. Mayor, I'd like you to perhaps reflect upon yesterday's meeting and how that can be translated into some immediate sanctions on behalf of Londoners. And Sophie will obviously support the Mayor. So that's the kind of the scene, and then we'll have Q&A through the rest of the meeting. Daniel, if you could briefly touch upon your strategy that was launched 2 days ago.
So thank you very much for the invitation to come here this afternoon. Like this group of people, the government's committed to breaking the deadly cycle of violence which is driving communities and families across the country. We published an ambitious strategy on Monday with 60 commitments and actions. The approach is not solely focused on law enforcement. It's very much a multi-agency response, working in concert with local government, the health service, probation and other partners, and it has prevention very much at the heart of the strategy. So I'd like to run through 3 things very quickly: my understanding of the trends, the analysis we've done on the drivers, and a quick canter through the main pillars of the strategy and the commitments, if that's okay. So there is clear evidence that homicide, knife crime and gun crime have increased since 2014 off the back of long-term decreases since the early 2000s. This has been accompanied by a shift towards younger victims and perpetrators. The increase has been driven primarily by 11 to 17-year-olds and by male-on-male cases, rather than by violence against women and girls. This is a big issue in London, but it's a national issue. Almost all forces have seen increases in serious violence since 2014, and the Office for National Statistics is clear that although some of the increase is driven by changes in police recording, part of it is real, and that's borne out by, in particular, hospital data. So that's the kind of the picture on the trends. In terms of drivers, we think that police recording is an important driver of the increases in police recorded crime, and we judge that amongst the drivers, changes in drugs markets are a very important driver. Two things going on here. Firstly, the emergence and the prevalence of county lines amongst gang groups exporting violence from urban street gangs out to county towns and seaside towns, using violence and exploitation to establish dominance and expand markets. Equally, the increased prevalence nationally of crack cocaine, which is very closely associated with serious violence. We think social media also plays a major part in terms of its use by a small number of people to glamorise drug dealing, to glamorise violence, to rile and taunt rivals, and to normalise weapon carrying. But we also judge that increases in vulnerable groups, including looked after children, excluded children and homeless, are an important marker for violence. And those are the major drivers. And then there are four major pillars to the strategy itself. The first is
if you do it quite briefly, we can draw these out later.
Of course. The first is around tackling county lines and the misuse of drugs. We've got a drug strategy, we've got a serious and organised crime strategy. We've published a county lines action plan, which includes 3.6 million investment in a national county lines coordination centre to build our capability to tackle this problem across 43 police forces. The second pillar is around early intervention and prevention. Really strong evidence in the strategy around what are the risk and protective factors for individuals, their family environments, their socio-economic condition and their school performance, and real strong evidence that balanced programme of early intervention and prevention can work. We're investing 11 million in targeted interventions in that space, and looking at rolling out investment also in using the teachable moment where a child ends up in a police custody suite or indeed in hospital. We think the multi-agency response is really important as the third pillar around supporting local partnerships. Clear role for community safety partnerships and other partnerships galvanised by police and crime commissioners to grip the problem, which should be a core part of their mission. And we're investing £1 million in each year of 18, 19, 19, 20 in grassroots knife crime community fund.
We've got most of these in our briefings.
Yeah.
That's perfectly fine.
And you've seen the media campaign. And lastly, I guess it's important just to quickly run through the law enforcement and criminal justice response. We're investing significantly in our ability to work in partnership with police and the social media companies to make sure that offensive material is not up on the net. We've announced an offensive weapons bill, in particular focused on acids, knives and guns, and equally looking at investment in data analytics nationally and what works across policing, and investing in inspections from HMI, Her Majesty's Inspector of Constabulary, around the effectiveness of the response to county lines. So those are the pillars of the response. Very quickly, we will have a national cross-sector serious violence task force to drive delivery, and equally, since it's an international trend, we're also going to be leading an international violent crime symposium to make it international.
That's genuinely though, Daniel, appreciate that. It is a significant piece of work, and it's worthwhile. And thank you, Pace, going through that. And we will get questions later. My only quick question on the 11 million for the 2 years in early intervention. That money is to be accessed by police and crime commissioners, I assume.
That's right. They will have a leading role working in partnership with multi-agency partnerships. That will work across the country, including in London, and we'll work with MOPAC and other colleagues in framing the criteria and the process around that to make sure we get maximum bang for buck and align very closely with work that the Mayor is already driving for.
All right, that's good. Now, sorry, Mr. Mayor, if I just ask you reflections on yesterday. I mean, you presented yesterday, we heard about strategy, and thank you, Deputy Mayor, for that. Any reflections on yesterday in the immediacy on how that yesterday would have helped us and what more has changed since then?
Well, first, Chair, can I thank you for calling this meeting. Like you and some members, I share the anger and concern that you have. And I thought the summit yesterday was extremely helpful. I think what we've done, central government, MPs, council leaders, myself, have parked, if you like, the differences we have, and you'll be well aware of the differences we have in relation to resources and other concerns, and seeing what we can do working together on the issues that we agree with. And Daniel has touched upon some of the areas where I think there is agreement between central government and regional government as well. I think that bodes well for our city and those worried about the increase in serious violent crime. The things that I think we agree with, alluded to in the presentation by the Home Office just now. The increase in serious violent crime began in 2014. The increase is a national one. So these are national problems that demand national solutions. All forces are experiencing an increase in serious violent crime. Drugs is a big factor. And some of the work the Home Office has done has been really informative to the work that the Met is doing. To be fair, the Met's been leading in some of this work across the country with the NCA, but it's really helpful to have that sort of research done from the Home Office. And also the international factor is really important. We by ourselves as a city can't solve the issue of drugs coming into our country, mainly Colombian origin drugs, the mixture of cocaine, baking soda equals crack, and the concerns there are around drugs, gangs and all the rest of it. The role of social media and the agreement we have there, we by ourselves with the best one in the world can't persuade the social media companies to do what we'd like them to do, but with the backing of national government there's a huge amount we can do. But also the really important thing the government can do working with us is coordination, multi-agency approach, banging heads together, frankly speaking. And that bodes well for the future. And Amber Rudd, the Home Secretary, was very positive yesterday about the role she sees government playing in bringing people together. But I'm looking forward to answering questions and having a debate.
That's very good, and thank you. Martin, turning to yourself, I think what we want to hear from you particularly, and at length, and we obviously heard from Cresta yesterday, who spoke more strategically, I think, around the issue, is the concern of Londoners, is how are you protecting them on the streets now, after Easter, last weekend, going forward and going into the summer. So if you could reflect on that and then take questions around that, it would be most helpful.
Okay, thank you, Chair. I think the first really important point for me to make is that what I'm going to talk about now didn't start after Easter or didn't start in the last month or two. So first of all, Commissioner was very clear a year ago when she arrived that violent crime was a priority for her, in amongst all those other priorities that emerged then. But we had been undertaking, and from the middle of last year, Operation Sceptre came into existence, and I've spoken at the PCC previously about the activity around Sceptre. So that work has been ongoing. Clearly, the issues over the last few months have really brought that into greater sharp focus. One important stat I think to put out there at the beginning, if you take the year we've just finished compared to the year before, the increase in knife violence, under 25 injured, is an increase of 57 offences, so 3%. So over that last 12 months, in terms of the injuries, we have, through all the activity that we've been undertaking, stabilised that level of violence. But what has clearly outstripped is the level of murders that have occurred. And when I talk about the murders, I'll talk about some of the reasons why I think we've found ourselves in the situation that we've found ourselves in. So this is not a start of activity, this is a continuation, it's a ramping up of activity based on the nature of the criminality that is taking place, the volume of the criminality that's taking place, and then also the focus through MOPAC and through the Mayor. So the Violent Crime Task Force that has been spoken about, and I'll talk about now exactly what that comprises, but it's really important, I think, for everyone at the outset to be clear that when I talk about the asset that is in the Violent Crime Task Force, that is the focal point for all the activity, but this is not activity that exclusively happens in there. For every one of our boroughs, the violent crime is the priority that they are working on, and all of those support services and other assets that you will be familiar with are being driven towards that activity. So the Violent Crime Task Force, as has been mentioned, and which will be funded over the next 2 years through the money that the Mayor has provided specifically for knife crime, will consist of roughly 120 officers, and that's made up of a number of groups that we are in the process of obviously pulling together as we speak. So we, as we sit here now, have 50 officers in the task force who are basically operating in a proactive sense. So they are targeting those primary areas where the level of offending is very significant. They are targeting those individuals that we know to be the habitual knife carriers, and they're targeting the other activity that we think is driving some of the violence. By the end of May, that group of officers will have been doubled up to just under 100 officers, and we're in the process at the moment of going through of identifying the individuals, because we need the right individuals to do this sort of work to come in, and we'll get those in by the end of May. As of Monday next week, we will have 38 officers that will be coming across from Trident. You'll all be familiar with Trident as the Gang Crime Command. 38 officers that will work in 2 teams, and what they will be doing is complementing the other task force officer. They'll be part of the broader task force. They'll be complementing the officers I just spoke about, but targeting, if you like, that next level up of particularly gang criminality and the groups that are driving not only the county lines but the other drug distribution, which undoubtedly is a driver of the criminality. In addition to all of that, on a daily basis, and we have been doing this for probably, I guess it's probably 2.5 weeks now, we have 4 police support units. So what we would call police support units are 100 officers who are uniformed officers that we are deploying around London to those places where it provides us with an additional presence. It allows us to support other operational activity. Last weekend, as a result of where we had got to last week, that number was actually doubled, and so we had 200 additional officers across London being deployed into those areas of highest risk. We will be repeating that over the coming weekend, and then after the coming weekend we then roll into, and the planning is going on as I speak, because by the middle of the following week we run into the very significant operation around the Commonwealth Heads of Government conference, which will be in London. So there'll be a significant deployment of officers anyway, and on the following Sunday London Marathon as well. So there will be a coordination of all of that activity, but as I say, a minimum of 4 police support units, so 100 officers in addition, and available for us to deploy through Operation Sceptre, which at the key weekends we're actually doubling that number.
Colleagues will ask later about the resource of those officers, where they're coming from and that sort of stuff, but I'll let colleagues pursue that a little bit later.
Well, those officers are coming from across the Met.
Exactly.
So now the PSUs, so the additional 100, we are paying for on overtime, so they're coming, so they're not drawn away from their duty for the day to do that. It is in addition to their normal duties, and we are bringing them together in the way that we support other operational activity, but we have the ability with the funding to do that on overtime. Right. The officers that are coming onto the task force, that becomes their posting, and then we will obviously backfill the posts elsewhere, so that the task force becomes an additionality to our core numbers based on the funding that we
opposed to the 7 units that are coming out a weekend.
Correct.
They're on overtime.
Yes, correct. So on top of all of that, you're aware of the Sceptre weeks of activity that we've been running, as I say, since last summer, which are a combination of heightened operational activity across London, but also diversionary activity, working in partnership activity, the weapon sweeps, the stuff you have all seen. A month ago, 2 weeks ago, but we basically set in that from this month onwards we will do 2 Sceptre weeks per month, so effectively doubling that amount of activity, so giving that real focus. And every borough in London has a dedicated plan around dealing with this issue and dealing with Sceptre, so it has its own plan around the knife crime and the violence, and that's what's enacted through those Sceptre weeks. We've had for some time coordination around Sceptre as an operation. We've now formalised that so that we have a pod sitting within the Special Operations Room at Lambeth, which coordinates all Sceptre activity, has a superintendent sitting in there running and controlling that activity, and then it also brings in all the pods that we have for the specialist teams in the Special Ops Room are brought together so that we are able to respond quickly to emerging threats or trends. We're able to respond to intelligence that we've got, and we're able then to deploy the asset that is available to operations sector.
So, that will be under the command of David Musker?
Yes.
So that's the kind of structure, as a new, semi-new structure carved out, particularly for this issue.
And we've turned that into a permanent pod sitting in the special ops room. And then obviously, if you project forward to next week, where you've got the big operations for Chogham and you've got London Marathon, it's able to sit in amongst all of that other command and control activity, so that we make sure that we are making the most use of all of our asset, and we're deploying to either threat or to opportunity, which we'll get through the intelligence activity. Sitting on top of that, and particularly focused, and I know we're primarily talking about knife crime, but I think we have to look at serious violence in the totality, and so looking at the gun crime. The assets work alongside Operation Viper, which is our sort of intelligence-led and overt activity in relation to gun criminality, and then the Radium operations, which is when we put Op Viper gun intel people out, we identify vehicles, and then we'll use armed response vehicles to intercept those vehicles. Those operations are running, and more of those operations are running, and again, some of the funding that we've received will allow us to increase the number of deployments we have for both Viper and Radium, which is largely intel and then armed response deployments to deal with people that we believe are carrying, supplying or potentially using.
It is important on that point is that the issues and the homicides ran across, and other colleagues have already pointed out, is not just knife crime, there's been gun crime, and it's not just young people, we've lost people in their 30s and older. So it is that more holistic issue of homicide generally that is of concern to London.
Well, yes, but for me it's the more holistic issue of serious violence.
Yes, Steve.
And quite honestly, it certainly includes knife crime, it includes gun crime. I would include a lot of the scooter-enabled criminality, which is by definition violent, and which we have significantly reduced over the last year. But I think you have to look at it all together, and what we're avoiding doing is having a very much, parcel it up and have a bit of activity here, a bit of activity. Because the other important point for me is the victim and suspect cohort is similar for a lot of these offending types.
Absolutely.
Whether you talk about the drugs activity, whether you talk about the robbery activity, whether you talk about the violence activity. So that's the kind of conceptually the way that we are focusing it. As I say, there's a plan on every borough BCU around this, which is overseen and governed through the operation sector control there. And we're building up and working up how we get very slick at understanding all the operational activity that is taking place all across London, because there's an enormous amount of operational activity. And one of our challenges, if I'm honest, is how we gather all of that and understand the full extent of it. So I was out yesterday doing some Sky Media stuff down in Brixton and dropped into the Safer Neighbourhood office at Cold Harbour, and they were all then telling me all these different jobs that they'd done and all the things they had achieved around this, but it's how we get all of that into the system to understand the full extent. So just going to the murders, there is no doubt that we have a significant stretch on our murder investigation capacity at the moment, as you would understand and expect. But just to give the very latest where we are on the figures for this year, 2018, it's actually now 51 homicides. The numbers do fluctuate, and there are two that I have... so that number is a reduction of some that have turned out not to be homicides, and there's also the two tragic case where the man murdered his wife and then took his two children to Sussex and committed suicide and dragged the children with him. So that they are both murders, and the murder of the wife is a murder, but clearly the suspect for that is dead. And also we are investigating the deaths of those two girls, but that's not London. So we then remain with 51 homicides. Of those 51, we have made arrests in 43 of those investigations, and that, as a summary, is 88 people that we have arrested in those 43 investigations. And we've made charges in 33 of those investigations, and that's 58 people that have been charged. And I think there's a couple of things that I would say. I think Daniel's comment about some of the younger element of people that are involved either as suspects or as victims in the murders is valid. I would say there are two other trends that we've noticed more latterly. One of those is the nature of the weapons, particularly when we're talking about knives, the nature of the weapons, i.e. the use of hunting knives, the so-called zombie knives, those kind of much more extreme weapons, and the level of violence that has been used. There would have been a time where I would have been sat here talking about this and probably commented on the fact that most knife homicides were a single puncture wound, and we have increasingly seen ones that are many more than a single stabbing, which speaks, I think, to some of the kind of the level of violence. And the other element, as you will have picked up from the numbers that I've just read out about people that we've arrested and charged, is the number of occasions where it's multiple suspects, where it is a group of individuals that are attacking another individual or individuals. And so that, again, adds complexity to the investigation process and then going forward the prosecution process. So I think those trends are relevant trends. Just picking up on another point that I know has had a lot of commentary and stop and search. There has been a real push in all of the sector activity for us to increase the level of stop and search. And just as the kind of for the latest figure, in the last 14 days, what we've conducted over 1,200 stop and search over that period. Important point to make out of that is just under, I think it was about 18% of those were directly related to weapons, so stop and search for weapons, and just under 20% of those resulted in an arrest. And that is a very high percentage conversion to an arrest in terms of stop and search. And what I think that point that I'm seeking to make is this is not blanket run out and do stop and search everywhere. This is about doing stop and search intelligently, particularly an increase in the use of the Section 60 power, which allows us to designate a particular area for a time-limited period, which then gives the officers the ability to stop and search without necessarily
some members have some questions around
formulating the ground.
So if we could come to it, because I'm
okay. This is all linked to an engagement strategy, so a community engagement strategy led by Commander Mark McEwen, who leads on community engagement and is working as bronze for all of this activity around community engagement, which is absolutely critical. So that is being done. So every one of those violence plans that exists on every one of the boroughs, the BCUs, clearly has an engagement element to it. And particularly that becomes important when you're talking about the stop and search, but it's also about how effectively we are working with all those particularly third sector groups that are on the ground, as well as statutory partners that are on the ground and can have an impact on this. Extensive media activity on our part to both raise the issue and also to get messages out there. We're doing that at a local level, we're doing that at a very senior level. We've got lots of media spending time with our officers and out there and seeing what is going on. The gun work I've talked about, but that continues apace, particularly within Trident and within the Serious and Organised Crime Command, but also working with NCA and National Ballistic Service and all the other agencies that work particularly around the supply point that the Mayor raised. And then lastly, because it got raised earlier, the social media element is one that does cause us concern. For some time, Trident have particularly worked at bringing down some of the YouTube videos that go up, which are either glamorising at one end or inciting the violence. And they're working, and we will link obviously into the national work to work with those companies. So I think that's a summary of where we're
And again,
doing.
that's very thorough, and we wanted to hear from you at length. Now on the opportunity for questions from Assemblyman Unmesh, I saw first.
Thank you, Chair. Chair, conscious of the time and that other colleagues also have questions, I'll be as brief as possible. Assistant Commissioner, thank you for everything you've done so far and for what you've told us. And obviously we'll keep the situation in review as we go into the summer. But the extra resources that you allocated in the wake of all the recent spate of attacks. So where have these officers come from? And clearly this has an impact on other areas of policing. So what impact does this have very specifically?
So we'd already been running some sector teams where we had effectively attached officers from either from boroughs or from other commands that they worked in, because it is the really important point to make about we need the right officers with the right kind of skills, the right kind of approach to do this work, because it's difficult work and we need those kind of people. So those were there. with the funding we've got, we're now able to put that into a formalised unit for the over that 2-year period. So they have come from whatever unit they were in. We've selected the 50 that are there now. We are in the process of selecting the next 50, who will then, and then as we go through our normal process of recruitment, those positions will be backfilled elsewhere in the organisation. But clearly, with the level of priority that this work has, and of course, they are going and doing their work in all of the boroughs as well. So it's about getting those officers in, getting the right skilled officers in, and then they will be backfilled as we work through our normal process, as we always do as we move people around the organisation.
But obviously this has an impact in other areas. I mean,
it will always have an when we move officers from one place to another, and as you will appreciate, you can't instantly go and get 400 new people. It works through our process and our recruitment as we feed it through, but we are always moving staff to those areas where there is a priority activity.
I mean, how do you decide to deploy this additional resources? I mean, presumably it's sort of demand-led or some sort?
Absolutely. So, as you would imagine, sitting alongside the SEPTA pod, the violence pod in the special operations room is an intelligence cell. That intelligence cell is sucking in all of our data around where the violence offences are happening, where the offenders, where the known knife carriers are, and we are deploying against that demand and where the problem is its greatest. Now, this is a problem that does exist to some extent across London. I think there's no area that is entirely immune, but there are quite clearly hotspot areas for the violence, particularly the knife violence and the gun violence. And clearly what we do is we will be tasking our resources and deploying our resources through an open tasking process that's based on that continual intelligence picture. And the more that we're able to deploy the resources, the more intelligence you receive back, the more you're able to refine that picture. And that's a fairly slick process now that works out of the special operations room.
Sure. And two more questions, Chair. Just to get my figures right, that I'm clear in my mind. So we've heard talk of 120 strong dedicated
Yes.
unit, and the figures you've given me, so you talked about 50 officers, then another 38 officers, and then 4 police support teams of 100 officers.
No, so you effectively get the 50 will be turned into another 50, and then you've got this. So it's around the 120. It'll be 120, 130. You get the 50 to 50, and then the 38 that are coming from Trident. That's the core group that will be full-time, ring-fenced to deal as the task force. The other number that I gave you about the 100 is the number that we are deploying on a daily basis to the areas of most concern, and that's the one that we doubled last weekend, and we will double again in the coming weekend. And then, as you alluded to, as we go through the summer, where we're now about to hit the point where we've got the big events coming up in the next 10 days. We're then into the ceremonial season with trooping and so on. We're then into the preparation for Carnival, and obviously all the other challenges that you have anyway with the summer. So that will be the ongoing plan to resource that.
And finally, I mean, the Commissioner's talked about, quotes, Al Capone tactics. We've seen the press headlines. I mean, what does this mean in practice?
What it means in practice is where we identify somebody that we believe is an offender involved with violence, we will use any opportunity that we can and any vulnerability that they have to get some sort of control over them, and ideally some sort of criminal justice outcome on them. So it's not we're waiting for them to be caught with a knife. We will deal with them in any way that we can deal with them. So you will deal with people through driving offences, you will deal with people through any other criminality, and the whole purpose of the kind of all the plans and all the boroughs is looking at where are our intervention points in any of these individuals. And particularly when you start talking about the drug criminality, some of the people when you get a bit higher up will be fairly cute, and you've got to find other ways to try and intervene on those people.
Yeah, now I've come across this approach before in the boroughs, but just so the public have clear understanding. Just finally, I just want to get this very clear, and it's not rocket science, but going back to the point of abstractions, that clearly the other serious areas that the public are concerned about, sexual offences and so on, these officers are clearly not being abstracted from
Correct.
those areas. That's it. Thank you. Sure.
Right, fantastic. Okay, I had Peter and then Joanne. Right, yeah, first time she's indicated. I've got her now.
I am. I'm off to live.
Martin, could I ask you mentioned
No,
section
yours.
6?
I've got you.
Yes.
You mentioned Section 60
Yes.
and the use of that. Can you explain, first of all, the extent to which you're using it? I mean, you know, because this is a very broad power, isn't it? So where and to what extent, and for that matter, when did you start using it?
Okay, so for those who don't necessarily know the difference, a Section 1 search under PACE allows me as a police officer, if I believe that I've got grounds to suspect that someone's either carrying a knife or drugs or other prohibited articles, I can search them. And I need those grounds before I can go through that process of searching that individual. What a Section 60 power does, it allows us to designate a geographic area for a specific time period, and in that geographic area during that time period, me as a police officer can go and search anybody without necessarily having formulated the grounds for the search. So it is entirely intelligence-led, and it will be entirely based around where we anticipate the potential for serious violence. So it could be, a classic example would be where we have a stabbing and you believe that that stabbing is Group A versus Group B. There will inevitably be a potential for response, for tit for tat, for some kind of action thereafter, and we would then look at an area and define that area for a time period. That area will be very clearly identified. The authority for that will be done at a very senior level. So although the request for that authorisation will start at the borough level, we will use our on-call commander, so the Gold London commander would be the person ultimately that would sign up and say, we're providing that Section 60 authority. You can do them for 24 hours, but we would always review them at the latest at 12 hours. So they don't just sit there, but the whole purpose of them will be to give us those additional powers in an area where we believe, based on intelligence, that there is a potential for serious violence.
Thank you for that. So what is the situation now, as it were? I mean, how many areas in London would have a Section 60, if you like?
I don't know right now what the number actually is, but I would say it would probably be half a dozen. You might have half a dozen operating across London.
About half a dozen.
Yeah.
And then the length of time of those, they're already in operation, and then basically they go on for how long?
So legally they go on for 24 hours, and then you have to formally review and decide whether you're going to continue that. But at each stage there is an authority process where a senior officer has to sign and say, I accept the intelligence, what the intelligence is saying, I recognise what that threat is, and I'm therefore authorising that.
Would you say that this is the, if you like, the last, the most effective way of dealing with an emergency like we have now? I mean, essentially, I would say this is a crisis. So would you say, therefore, that this is really the greatest power you can have to deal with the situation as it is now?
I think it's one of our, in purely enforcement terms, I think it's one of our stronger powers that allows us to be able to put, because the kind of areas where we would be authorising the Section 60 would be the areas where we would be deploying the additional resource, and what it's doing is giving those officers the ability to go into that area and conduct the stop and search to basically to take the weapons off individuals.
We've pursued that one a lot. We've got a lot of questions coming out, so if you're happy with that answer, Peter. Right, Joanne.
Yes, can I thank you for the outline of this very concerted effort you are making. And the Mayor visited Tottenham last week and was very grateful you did, Mr Mayor, and heard, particularly from young people, about their concerns around safety. I think representing Tottenham, the shooting, the murder of Tanisha Melbourne really hit a particular nerve. I think there's a real need, and your extra resources you're putting in, a lot of those will be covert, but there are, or plainclothes, but there is a real need to see visible patrolling, not just on high streets, but in estates where people live. Do you have the resources to actually do that, and is that your plan?
So first of all, that is a significant part of all the local operational plans, and I was in fact talking yesterday to the borough commander at Haringey about that very thing, because I think there's two elements to that. So one of them is about that presence, the physical, visible presence element, and those additional police support units that I referred to are all uniformed. They're all uniformed officers. So it's about that presence, and us using all of our asset, using our neighbourhood teams, using all the other assets we have available to provide that presence. And it's also, which I think is part of the balance to the point about the stop and search, is it's also about our officers being out there and engaging, not just engaging in the confrontational way when I'm about to search somebody, but engaging in that way with young people generally. Because the message around feeling fearful, the message around that causing some people to carry knives is loud and clear, and we've got that and get that at a local level. So the plans are all about getting as much presence at the right times and in not just the high street, in all the right places, and doing things like the sort of what we would describe as the pulse patrols, where you're in an area for a short period of time and then go to another, to really maximise that presence and visibility, rather than someone going and spending 5 hours in one particular location, looking at places where we can maximise the number of members of the public that we're hitting. So all of that thinking is there, and it is a significant part of what we're trying to achieve. And that's part of that overarching reassurance work.
To turn to you, Mr. Mayor, I mean, these tactics, many of which have been employed over some months, but clearly there's been a ramping up of these tactics. Have you been briefed fully on this? Have you been constantly in conversations with Cressida and Martin around how this has been evolving over the recent weeks?
Yeah, and Sophie and I are in almost daily contact. We are anyway with the police and senior police, including over the period you're talking about. The Commissioner was around, as indeed we were. And these regular conversations we have, and the police are working incredibly hard. Can I just make one point, which is, I think Unmesh talked about the impact of extracting, your words, resources, but I think we've got to realise the impact on police officers having rest days cancelled, working overtime, and just I want to use this opportunity, Chair, through you to thank the police through Martin, who are working incredibly hard. And what we're doing is we're asking the same number of officers, because it takes 9 months to recruit, the same number of officers to do the work of far greater officers, and they are knackered.
I mean, for the record, this is recorded, will be published later. I support those sentiments completely. We're asking officers to put in extra hours, to cancel leave, and I think that has to be noted and appreciated, but also listening to you, Martin, about the future task force is going to be a unit in and of itself, and not that demand on officers. Right, I saw Caroline next.
Follows on from that, and this is not just seasonal, as the previous Commissioner told me when I raised the issue of knife crime going back in 2014. He told me it was seasonal, and I think we've shown that it's been going up, as the Mayor said at the start, since then. What conversations have you had, Mr Mayor, with British Transport Police, for example, in terms of the county lines and the access out, and also maybe with the City Police in terms of whether we can use some of their resources to help, particularly at this time where resources are so stretched?
Caroline, Martin may want to come in because it got some media coverage, the teamwork taking place between the Met, City in particular, and BTP, but that teamwork takes place all the time actually, and so of course our resources are stretched, but I want you to think that's the first time BTP and City have worked closely with the Met Police. For example, Servitor is a good example where there's that teamwork taking place. So the phrase, the policing jargon is assets. They use whatever assets are there, and I'm learning the jargon, whatever assets are at their disposal. And the good thing is the Commissioner and the other Commissioners have a really collegiate relationship. The county line stuff is really interesting, Caroline. One of the things that the Met Police lead on, Duncan Ball, is some of the work taking place across the country. And one of the criticisms made of the Met in the past is we aren't very teamwork orientated outside of London. And that's a criticism made by former parliamentary colleagues of mine. But I'm hoping that colleagues from around the country will now see greater teamwork. And I know the Home Office are very keen to see that taking place, because what we're seeing is criminal masterminds who are now using the inverted commas fragmentation of 43 police forces to run rings around some of us.
So the serious violence strategy and the county lines action plans are national plans, but they have a very strong London imprint for reasons that the Mayor was describing. On county lines, Duncan Ball has been the architect of the National County Lines Coordination Centre, which will map the spider's web of county lines, coordinate the tasking, the intelligence, the deconfliction. So it's very a kind of strong contribution to the national issue. You talked a bit about county lines and British Transport Police. British Transport Police aren't our only workforce on the transport network. We've also got people in bus companies, in rail companies, and we've got a targeted communications campaign to help those workforces to spot the signs and engage with, either directly with law enforcement or via Crime Stoppers, to spot those signs of violence and exploitation.
Okay, thank you.
And I just to say that I have regular meetings with City of London, the British Transport Police, to discuss all sorts of matters that are pertinent to us. But as you'll know, just before Herder, we announced the £3 million of MOPAT money on on tackling county lines that will be up and running very soon, and that is absolutely, obviously focused on county lines and working on that. We're already funding £3 million into that work.
Okay, and I just also wanted to pick up the issue of prevention and so on that you've been talking about. Youth workers in A&Es we've talked about for a long time. You've signed off a decision to confirm them again for the 4 major trauma centres. These separate decisions are supposed to be coming others. When will we see them in all A&Es in London? I think Mr Mayor and the Home Office look like they're supporting that too. Are you actually putting some money in to help the Mayor fund this across London?
Yeah, we are. So Redfred do tremendous work in a number of trauma centres. Maybe colleagues around the table have
we know
seen
them. We know them well.
Yeah, and so they operate in major trauma centres in London. They're looking to expand outside of London to Birmingham and Nottingham, and we're expanding that beyond the major trauma centres to the wider hospital network.
Are you putting money in to help the Mayor at the other areas in London?
We are investing directly in that. Clearly, in a small, innovative, voluntary organisation, there are growth capacity issues, so we need to kind of make sure we invest in that in a way which is sustainable. But we are making investment.
The money that we're putting into working in accident emergency units and trauma centres, you're right, we've signed off the 4 major trauma centres.
4, yes.
And we are expanding into more accident emergency units. We're not going to be in every accident emergency unit because we are putting extra money in through the Mayor's extra money into the area.
But perhaps we'd get in writing how much the Home Office are putting in alongside the Mayor on this.
I mean, this is very timely because within the report that I read, there's more money coming from the Home Office to support Redfred with the capacity building. You're talking about outside London, and obviously not every A&E would necessarily merit it, but we know some not far close from my borough, of course, that would require it. Martin, briefly, want to comment?
Just literally one comment, just to clarify, Caroline, for you. BTP and City of London Police are entirely integrated into the violence work with us. They are part of the process, and we have their people deployed every single day with us in one form or another. So it is.
Susan.
Thank you. Actually, it picks up on something the Mayor and you've been talking about. The county lines are clearly of great concern, and my question was going to be around the fact that the Met has got a terrible reputation for picking up from the other forces around us. They're very willing to pick up and make arrests, and the Met isn't. Now, I'm very happy if you're going to deny that. Is this a figure that is picked up by MOPAC to make sure that you know, if there are requests for pickups from other forces, that we don't ignore them, as in we being the Met, being London?
Just can I confirm when you say a pickup, what you mean precisely by that?
Well, if you get requests from other forces to pick people up on the streets or make arrests, whatever,
right?
Other forces or other commissioners are saying that they're more than happy to pick up for the Met if the Met make the requests.
Okay.
But the Met is less likely to listen and pick up people that they want on the streets, which clearly they're wrong uns, and we would want them off our streets. If that's incorrect, we'd all be delighted to hear that, because it affects. But is this a figure that is picked up? Are there KPIs around this, or is it a figure that is monitored by MOPAC to make sure this isn't the case?
No, I don't think it's monitored. It's not. That's not a picture I recognise. But perhaps if you had some outside, give me an example, or people who've done, I would happily look at it. But it's not a picture that I would recognise.
Well, if it helps, Chair, I mean, I think the criticism is, I'll be very careful with my language, us exporting criminality elsewhere, particularly children. So children from London being sent by gangs, exploited to go to other parts of the country is a big concern, no doubt, expressed by colleagues around the countryside. But if there's examples you've got of, please let us know.
I've been being told that it's the other way. Other forces are happy to pick up for the Met, but the Met isn't as quick to pick up for them. Which, of course, if that is the case, if it is, and we'll talk outside, then clearly there's criminals on our streets that we're being asked to pick up that we're not. So I'd be more than happy that that this isn't the case.
And is that specifically in relation to county lines or generally?
Yes.
Oh, right.
Yes,
So,
specifically to county lines.
Okay. Specifically in relation to county lines, that's not an accusation that I've heard or examined. However, the creation of the National County Lines Coordination Centre will give us a national picture of the networks, of the request, the tasking, the intelligence, and that will give us much firmer data to bear out the patterns of collaboration, but that isn't an accusation I've heard.
We've got some intelligence around that. We'll let you have that outside this committee. Right, Tony, did you want to come in?
Yes, Mr Mayor, at the recent MQT we spoke about devolving the probation services, and we had a bit of a barge about that at the time, but I think in the non-political world that we're now in, hopefully in the next few weeks, would you be prepared to look again with the Ministry of Justice in terms of a pilot so we control probation services in London, appreciating the point that a number of them actually have contracts going for another 5 years, but in terms of things that we can control some of the good learning in London, because clearly most of the people that have been victims or alleged assailants in the last few days have been through probation at some stage.
I'm not sure what specifically you mean. I mean, I'm always in favour of more devolution, particularly if resources follow the power being devolved.
The point I made last time, and which I thought you agreed with, was when they set up the police and crime commissioners under the previous Home Secretary, the now Prime Minister, the view was from most people and most politics at the time that eventually probation services would follow, and of course you are the PCC for London. So do you favour that devolution, and do you think it would actually help to make sure that we can get a grip of people that are offending and reoffending again?
I'm all in favour of additional powers and additional resources. In fact, the agreement that the Justice Secretary and I signed recently was the direction of travel was at some stage in the future for us to have the situation where those sorts of things can be devolved, but there's going to be powers and resources. But the contract, just so you know, factually, the CRC contracts go until 2021, 2022, so I'm afraid the bad news is for the foreseeable future, we're stuck with these private companies doing a bad job.
Okay. On a separate point, what have you personally learnt in the last 7 to 10 days, apart from when you need to step back and allow to delegate to your team here, and when you need to step in as Mayor when something like this happens?
A great team around me, the Commissioner, Deputy Commissioner, Assistant Commissioner, the Deputy Mayor, City Hall and Met Police work incredibly hard day in, day out, and I'm grateful to be surrounded by such a hard-working team.
But what have you personally learnt in terms of when you need to step in?
Well, one of the things that I can't be accused of is being work shy. I work full-time, I've got one job, one salary, and I take my work very seriously. I've not been on holiday, I've not been away, I've been working incredibly hard, talking daily with my Deputy Mayor and the Met Police Service, and my admiration for the police and my team has increased over the last period. What I have also learned is that the government are now publishing a serious violence strategy, which actually echoes some of the things we've been saying. The good news that should reassure the Assembly is many things published in the knife crime strategy are in the serious violence strategy, which reassures us we're on the right lines. And I'm hoping that although we'll disagree on the issue of resources and the commitment in relation to that, and we can park that for a second, in relation to other issues, I think the silver lining, and forgive me for saying it this way, bear in mind we're talking about lives being lost and families being bereaved, is actually we have now everyone's attention focused towards serious and violent crime.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Leonie.
I know that obviously we've achieved a degree of unity amongst Assembly members and obviously with yourself around the need for additional resources, and with the leak from the Home Office, obviously there is clearly concern in other places about resources. So I wondered if you could probably give us maybe just a comment to say, are you confident that we can deal with this within the very constrained resources that we have at the moment within the Met, because we do need obviously to make the streets safer?
Things are really hard. I mean, resources are stretched. Police officers and others are working incredibly hard. Let me give you just one example. Joanne referred to my visit to Harrogate, Tottenham last week. I went to the youth centre that Tanisha frequented recently, Tanisha Melbourne Blake, and was speaking to her best friends and the youth workers, and they made a number of points. One, that youth centre, which was a second home to those young people in Tunisia, second home, was threatened with closure last year because of government cuts. The youth workers there, who were devastated, they were just distraught, were seen by the young people as second parents, were threatened with their jobs being lost a year ago because of government cuts. That council's now got one youth centre which have had to work reduced hours. Now, if we agree that youth centres are a good place for young people to go to engage in constructive activities. Youth workers do a remarkable job. We should invest in them. And a number of colleagues around this room have done research and work in relation to the cuts made over the last period. That's just a fact. It's not a tribal political point. And so, we're doing what we can to invest in youth services, using business rates money to invest in youth services, put aside the investment in the policing. Doesn't fill the hole, though. And so, although there's agreement in relation to those things we definitely agree on, I don't think we should pretend that there's been an agreement from politicians. Yes, the civil servants who work for the politicians agree there's a link between reduction in policing, increase in crime. I'm not sure if the politicians in central government accept there needs to be increased resources. And the £40 million that has been referred to in the media from central government is not new money. It's moving money around the Home Office, and the question that needs to be answered is, where's that money come from? And so, look, we'll do what we can in London. We always do. We do what we can within the resources that we have. And as I said to you, it's worth remembering, it means the same number of officers doing the work that in 2010 was done by 33,500 officers, roughly speaking 5,000 PCSOs, roughly speaking a police staff with an additional 3,000 plus police staff, and on and on. So, we've got to understand the context. It's really important.
And I've had that discussion with my local borough commanders, and the pressure on the individual officers is obviously, it's quite severe and quite intense. And obviously we know the context in 2017 with the big events and the knock-on then into the ordinary staff. But you just referred to PCSOs, which is one area that I'm quite concerned about. I think the way that the figures are going at the moment, it's a lagging indicator. You can move the numbers of officers around, but you won't necessarily see the impact in terms of what happens on the streets until you've changed the numbers. And it's been going up since 2014, and we have been reducing, particularly the PCSOs, for some period of time. Now, I completely understand in the current context, there's no chance of returning to 3, 2 and 1, 3 PCSOs, 2 PCs and 1 sergeant per safer neighbourhood team ward, which is where we were, in the first place when we started setting up the safer neighbourhood teams, and then nationally people copied what we were doing in London. But I do wonder whether we need to be focusing in more on recruiting to the PCSO level. I know there was a lot of fuss about they're not real police officers, but that's partly the point, because they can have those links in with the families. I think Clive Efford was talking about them playing football. They can do the links with the youth workers. My background, working in social housing, they form fantastic links on housing estates. Is that something, instead of focusing on having the 2 dedicated PCs per ward, maybe we need to rethink that and be looking more towards the PCSOs, and not because they're cheaper, but because they offer a different community link in.
Just to give you an idea of numbers, so New York, which has been talked about in the last few weeks, a smaller city than ours by a bit, has 36,000 police officers, roughly speaking 15,000 additional staff. We have 30,000 police officers, roughly speaking 1,300 PCSOs, and roughly speaking 3,500 police staff. So in terms of staffing numbers, there's New York and there's London. But if you compare and contrast the last time we had a knife spike compared to where we are now, we had far greater police officers, far greater police community support officers, and far greater numbers of police staff. And they're important. They're police assets. They're the people who do the analysis. They're the people who build a good relationship with the community. They get the intelligence from the community. They free up the police, the other police officers to do other serious work. But also, it doesn't just affect serious violent crime in relation to knives and guns, but also you speak to counter-terror experts. You speak to the Mark Rallos and the Neil Bassus, they will tell you of the thwarted terror attacks because of the confidence the public has with police officers, which needs them given intelligence as well.
Mr. Mayor, this is accepted around this table, and I think for another time, and we understand the importance of that around intelligence on the streets, and I want you just to take, because I've got 6 other people who want to ask questions. If you're happy with that response, Leonie, can I move on to colleagues?
I might write to Sophie and the Mayor about the focus on, because I would like to see an increase in PCSOs, if we can build that in, even within the restricted resources for the reasons that I've outlined.
And I've got some sympathy for that. Okay, so next, Len, did you want to come in?
Please. Look, I don't think we can divorce resources from this. I don't think your plan is sustainable from what you outlined, and I'm very grateful for how you outlined the activities of where we started from. But if there was a ramping up of activities, it would have been lost on the outside world and the media. Because as far as they're concerned, and why we're meeting today, and why the summit took place yesterday, that really the activity started during the week and at this weekend. And I'm quite interested in the sustainability issue. And I would say this, and for the sake of repeating yesterday, my colleagues are going to talk about the county lines, and I think it is a national issue, and it's an our issue as well. It's a London issue, national issue. I agree with that. But actually, if you put all your eggs into that basket, we don't deal with violence per se. So on some of the things where I think you started from, I was getting quite excited because I think we've talked about this in the past. We've got it in the Mayor's plan, and I think Cressida made it very clear. We need a comprehensive strategy of dealing with violence per se, and you need to chew and walk gum at the same time. Your organisation, our organisation, isn't very good at doing that. It focuses on this, and quite frankly, you know, the county line's important. It's a driver, but it's not the only driver in terms of what's happening on our streets. And be very clear about this. We cannot allow our police force to be ineffective or weakened, and the perception by bad people or ordinary people that want your protection. And I think that's quite interesting about young people in that relationship with you, because they think you can do diddly squat to protect them. So they won't come forward, they don't see you as coming forward, and I think some of those issues. And I'd like to just see, before I get into my question, a little bit more about some bail conditions. Anyone walking outside a police station without bail conditions imposed on violent crime, I don't want to see that in the Met. I've just had a sneaky suspicion that we're not utilising some of those issues of sending a very strong message to people about who commit violence in our community and what we expect. And I'd like you to push it. I'd like you to push it as far as it go. I'd like you to tell all your officers who do these and write this up what the expectation is, because then that could be quite one small thing that could make a difference or get some of these people and send messages back to them. And particularly about, you know, in terms of trying to stem some of the violence. So in the short term, one of the things that does concern me, whether you're for the BCU mergers or not, if you're telling all your senior management staff that they're spending 40% of their time working up because people are at different levels of their issue, it means they're not spending 40% of that time that we should be focused in the short term of the crisis we face. And I do think it's a crisis in terms of numbers. I understand what you were saying about the stats, but where people were coming from. And in some ways, because the meetings we're holding now almost lead to that. I do accept the Met had a number of activities in that last year. But I think the trauma that we're all facing and shocked by, even police officers shocked by it, has led us into maybe some of that action. So in that sense, about what gives on the other bit of the organisation when people are focused on that activity like BC mergers, when they should be giving the leadership and drive that we need to deal with this issue in the short term to stem the flow of deaths and stem the flow of violence before we get into the long-term issue. Because I think there's we're not the best because we're going all over the place with short-term and long-term issues. And I just really wanted to know about that and the sustainability of those operations. How are we going to sustain this, when I say short-term, up to the next school summer holidays? Because I think that's what we're asking for. And I think that's a tall challenge to you and to the organisation for what the Mayor rightly said, the pressures we're putting on you.
It is a tall challenge. The plan will take us right the way through to the end of the year in terms of managing that. And as I say, that is a plan that's managing the resourcing and at the same time fitting in over that time period all those big events that we know are going to happen, some of which complement, some of which present a challenge. As far as people not being focused on it, I don't accept that we can't do both of those things at the same time. And we had yesterday, literally at the meeting that I go to around all the change, that is the key risk that was put up for the whole programme, was doing all of this at the same time as maintaining day-to-day business. Because the challenge we have, like many organisations, is we can't step off the conveyor belt and do a load of organisational change and come back on when we're ready. We are 24/7 every day. So that's the challenge we are putting to our folks to do. but I don't think anyone is not focused on this. The point about county lines, and that was why I wanted to make the point to the chair about, I won't talk about this in one, it's all knives or it's all this, it's all, because it's completely missing the point. And if I'd have thought of it, I could have brought a picture that I drew, which was about, if you put violence in the middle, it is the nexus around a whole range of different issues that kind of come together, and where they all cross over is we get serious violence, mostly amongst young people, not exclusively, but certainly under 30s, let's say, mostly. And that's what we've got to approach, and that's what we've got to try and tackle. We've got to make sure that we're able to do our bit of that, which is, primarily the enforcement part, but then we've got to get all the other bits working together. And I take the bail point is an absolutely perfect, fine one. And just to give you that example, with that neighbourhood team yesterday in Cold Harbour, their thing they wanted to, or Loughborough, I beg your pardon, the thing they wanted to tell me about was they got a woman who had been with some gang members. They stopped her. She had a big knife in her bag. They not only got her charged, they got her remanded for court. So she went to court yesterday morning, which is where we should be. Now, we can get into the whole debate about the whole criminalising and all of that. That's not for now. But the point is that's where we are in terms of making sure that when we get that opportunity, we're going to get people in front of the courts if that's the right thing to do.
Okay, just a very quick point. I listened very carefully to Cressida Dick yesterday, and I didn't want to raise it. It wasn't the right time to raise it there, but it is the right time to raise it here. She said very clearly, there are some, you are going to be hearing from me in the coming year about the extras that we won't be doing in the Met. What debate has gone on at a senior level of the Met, and what's the flavour? What does it mean when we won't be doing certain things? Because I think there has to be an acceptance about that. You know my view about where we are, but it's the question of who decides that. Are you going to talk to us about it? Not me, the community. It's policing by consent. We shouldn't forget that. Or is this something that's driving you forward because of that sustainability issue? So, and my final point on county lines, and I've got to say this, and maybe I'm jaded and I'm just a little bit too cynical. Of course it's a national priority, because you don't resource police services outside London. Never mind the London debate about resources and the pressures on them to deliver, because they've got less. I understand that. But the question is, don't start, saying it's a national problem, we're going to drive it up because the figures. It's because we haven't got the resources to do it. And yes, you are allowing us to raise the money, but if it's a national priority, you could do a special grant on it. That could make a difference, and treat it like counter-terrorism, because that's how we should treat some of the drugs issue and the prevent strategy that goes along it, and think about how do we have a national strategy around it.
So we are specifically investing 3.6 million over 2 years for the County Lines Coordination Centre. We are driving forward a multi-agency.
You need a sustainable approach
on that.
Well, need a sustainable approach.
Can I come back to you on to the point
sustainable approach?
If you could, I'm going to take, if I may, I've got time for 2 more questions after this. If you can answer this briefly, I have 2 questions. What we're then going to do, because we're going to run out of time, thank you for your forbearance, is any questions that haven't been asked, we'll write to group leads and we will write to you, both, Mr Mayor, on those questions. So if you could answer that one briefly, then I'm going to take 2 more questions. Daniel, you had a...
So I answered the county lines point, but I think you were kind of suggesting that county lines was in some way kind of something which was distracting from the core business of dealing with serious violence in London. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about the public health approach to serious violence. For me, the public health approach to serious violence means 3 things. First of all, taking a really forensic scientific approach to understanding the trends and the drivers and tackling those drivers head on, including social media and county lines. It means working in partnership, everyone pushing together. You've spoken a lot, and the colleagues have spoken a lot about the police service. As the Mayor was saying, it only works if the police service works shoulder to shoulder with probation, local authorities, health and other partners. And thirdly, when we're talking about a public health approach, it's dealing not just with enforcement, but getting upstream and thinking about prevention. And I think there's been a lot of talk today naturally about the enforcement approach and the effectiveness of the criminal justice system. I think there's a much wider conversation that we could and should be having about
Chair, one stat about it, and it comes from the Met, on county lines and gangs work. So last week we had the updated issue from Trident that 20% of knife crime is gang related. That's your county lines, that's 20% if we take what the Met is considering. It's important and we should be on top of it and we should be doing it. I'm not saying we shouldn't, but actually that's what I'm saying. If we miss the wider issues of violence in London, because we concentrate on that and get that bit right, we won't be getting much more right. That's why I say we need a sustainable approach, and that's my message back to you in national government, and that's what I tried to say yesterday during the summit.
That point's been well made, and I concur with that. Right, we've got Andrew and Jeanette. We've got 5 minutes between the two of you.
Well,
Off you go.
come on to gang-related violence, and probably picking up where Len just left off. In June, 9 months ago, we were told that 5% of this was related to gangs. Then in March this year, Commander Stokely says he's 20% related to gangs. So what's driven that change, assuming it has been a change? And equally, from the other side of the coin, if 20% is gang related, that means 80% isn't. So what's the other 80%?
So I have to say I don't necessarily recognise the 5% figure, but if
Well,
that's what you're saying,
it was in the
you
Mayor's knife
told...
crime strategy.
Sorry?
It was in the Mayor's knife crime strategy.
Okay, but I suppose the fundamental point is it's just being careful about where we end up categorising and where we end up labelling, quite frankly. And when I did the thing I did yesterday, they had a bunch of young people there, and they were all asked by the interviewer, you know, have you been involved in gangs? And the best answer was from this young lad, said, well, I'm not part of a gang, but I live in a place where there is a gang operating, and I suppose you'd say I'm affiliated because I'm on that estate. So I think my personal view is I think we don't want to get too hung up about the definition. We're talking about young people committing violence against young people. You know, I've worked in Trident, I've worked in the homicide world. Post-event, defining that was because of this or that is often not a science by definition. And the fact that I'm in one gang and you're in one gang, our violence might be nothing to do with it. It might just be for any other. So I just think we've got to be careful about it, and why I say we step back and we look at that range of the violence that is taking place. The statistic I would be really focusing on is how many of those under 30s, because that is getting you into that sort of group activity territory, and focus as we are focusing on that. And then you will have all that other 80% is made up of the other range of reasons why people come into conflict with one another.
Can I ask you then about high-level gang members? I think Cressida called them the Mr. Biggs.
Yeah.
I think it might be Ms. Biggs as well, but I think mainly Mr. Biggs.
Pretty much exclusively
And
Mr.
she also talked about Albanians
Yeah.
being behind this.
Yeah.
To what extent are Albanians behind this? And looking at the Home Office, if we've got an Al Capone approach, why aren't we using immigration enforcement to deal with some of these people?
Well, so when you start getting to that, I hate that term, Mr. Big. I'm not criticising the Commission. I don't like that expression. It kind of glamorises it, in my opinion. There are people at the top of criminal organisations who, that's what their job is. They are criminals. They are largely driven by making money. And then what will go with that is all the illicit things they do, and normally violence attached to it. There is a whole strand of activity that we undertake within our Serious and Organised Crime Command, alongside the National Crime Agency and other forces, and alongside Borders and Immigration, alongside HMRC, and the whole range of government agencies that should be tackling those people that are operating at that level. One of the really significant things that makes London amazing is the diversity of all the communities in London. That also makes it quite challenging in terms of dealing with particularly serious criminality, because you've got the whole world is in this city, and it's why sometimes the comparisons made to other cities aren't perhaps so relevant. But I wouldn't pick on any particular group. We know there are criminal organisations that operate. We have a whole system working through Serious and Organised Crime Command to tackle those. They work absolutely with the National Crime Agency. We're a key player in the Serious and Organised Crime meeting that is run by the Home Sec, and we are part of that and working with all those other agencies. And a lot of the sort of Achilles or Al Capone or whatever you want to call it tactics will be around immigration issues, it will be around tax issues, it will be around a whole range of things that you can get at, because what most of those people are not doing is getting their hands dirty with any violence or hands on any drugs or guns or any other contraband.
Last question from me then on firearms. What sort of firearms are we seeing the use? Has it moved beyond the old-fashioned handguns into something rather more violent? What's been done to control guns, and also what's been done to control access to ammunition as well? Because a gun's no good if it's not got any bullets to put in it.
So, I mean, the trends wax and wanes. Largely, you are still talking about handguns. Handguns are easier to get, but they're also much easier to conceal. any criminal wants to... We still do not have large numbers of people who are prepared to use firearms in this country, thankfully. It is still quite difficult to get the kind of viable firearm they want and the right ammunition at the right point in time, because the penalties are so significant around possession of firearms, and we've seen that, I think, has been a really key factor in that. We work really closely within London, but we work really closely again with the NCA, again with all the other agencies, to look at those points of entry. I would say there is a trend has emerged around kind of parcel, so delivery, where you'll get parts of a weapon being delivered, and that's one issue. There are a number of issues around weapons coming in, particularly from the Balkans and other areas where there's been significant conflict. But there's a lot of activity undertaken by the Met in London, working with the national infrastructure and NABIS, the National Ballistic Intelligence Service, which deals with all firearm or gun-related criminality in this country, and as I say, the NCA and all the other agencies. So it is a continual effort around that, and I think, again, if we go back and look at the figures, we've made significant steps in terms of reducing the amount of gun criminality when you actually look at the demographic and the scale of this city. And certainly we've had recently comparisons to US cities. Well, let's do that comparison, and that's I think we've got reasonably good control, but constantly trying to improve that.
Jeanette, you're going to ask probably the shortest question you've ever asked. That leaves us plenty of scope.
No, that's a bit unfair. And my question is to the Mayor, and I'm sure he'll give me 5 minutes. And Mr. Mayor, can I just start by stroking you and feeding back from my constituents how they're feeling confident that with your background and with your hard working ethic at this time of crisis, they really appreciate what you're doing. Would you agree, now we're looking at community reporting, which we hear a lot about, would you agree with me that people living in communities where the so-called hotspots have been identified, that they know the people who are carrying guns and knives, and they have the intelligence useful to the police? Are you satisfied that the level of intelligence from the community is at a good level? And if not, what's your thinking about how we can make sure that people feel more confident and safe to come forward with this vital information?
I would say one of the things that must compound the bereavement families feel when they've lost their loved one is the fact that there were clearly people present when their loved one was stabbed or shot, and they're not coming forward to assist the police in investigating what happened. And also, I'm sure the Assistant Commissioner will confirm this, but often when the police are speaking to a victim of an often horrific crime, often the victim aren't giving the police information that would assist the police in investigating that very serious criminal activity. And that's one of the reasons why we talk about this phrase, policing by consent. Len referred to it. We need to understand what that actually means. That means the public having confidence in the police and the authorities to come forward, to give intelligence, to report crime, to be witnesses, and on and on and on. And the police are working incredibly hard. The evidence I have of the last 2 years is every life is valuable to the police. Every person who's the victim of a serious violent crime matters to the police. There isn't, I'm telling you, there isn't some sort of situation where the police think this person is a victim of crime deserves more attention than this person. If there was the case, I'd say that loud and clear. It's not the case. And we've got to engender a situation where people come forward. Every time I do a media interview and I get the opportunity, I mention the Crime Stoppers the number, 0800 555 111. You can ring the police and the authorities with anonymity and they'll pursue this matter. If it's an emergency, 999 or 101. And I make this point, and it's just an observation from what Leonie said. Yes. But we can't escape the fact that safer neighbourhood teams change the culture. I'll give you my personal example, Jeanette. I grew up in London, and I tell you this, when I saw a police officer walking down the road, I'd cross over the road. Yeah. I didn't want the hassle of being stopped and searched, empty my pockets out, and all the rest of it. But in the noughties, 2000 onwards, I saw the change in young people. They would have lunch with police officers in the school, they'd have assemblies with police officers, there'd be a positive body language, and two things that are important. The first experience a police officer had with a young person wasn't an altercation, it was positive. Similarly, the first interaction that a young person had with a police officer was positive. Clive talked about playing football, and on and on. And so It's really important. This is a complex issue, but you know, we have a role to play as leaders in our communities. We can reassure the public to come forward and report things, and it's really important that they do so.
But in addition to that, PCSOs, from my experience of being the Assembly member for Hackney, Islington and Waltham Forest, and that gives me a day-to-day experience of some real horrors. It was the PCSOs who made that bridge because they were recruited from the black community, from the Turkish communities. They knew where the bush was, that they, when they were young, that's where knives were hid. And without them, we are missing that bridge. And I share Leonie's concerns. We have got to get back to building that bridge.
Well, I'm really proud that this year we've invested record amounts. City Hall in the Met Police Service, £110 million. It builds on the £40 million we invested last year. In my first 2 years as mayor, I've increased council tax preset to the maximum allowed. Now, it's just an observation. The previous mayor froze it and made cuts. Well, hold on a sec. We knew from 2010 that the Met Police would be losing money year after year after year. We should be planning for that. So we've got to invest, and I'm invested in the police service. But you're right, community support officers played and continue to play an invaluable role.
Thank you.
Right, okay. Thank you for that. And thank you for your forbearance on time. If there are questions that have been answered, please write to me and I'll write to you. Ultimately, this committee is going to be publishing a report in May, June around serious violence and knife crime. This work will inform that. Mr Mayor and Martin and Daniel and Sophie, thank you for coming along. The committee will continue to scrutinise you both and all of you around this issue because there is a crisis in London, and although we're hearing some positive things, we need to make sure that Londoners are safe. Again, I thank members and we will continue from there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Steve.
Sorry,
Thank you.
GLA, Committee Room 5, Sound.